7 enemy ships have appeared off the coast. They are burning everything. This was the meaning of one of the final urgent messages sent from Ugarit, a rich city on the coast of what is now Syria. The city was asking for help. But help never came. Soon, Ugarit disappeared from the map. Its palaces burned, its streets became silent, and its people vanished from the written story of the ancient world. But Ugarit was not the only place in danger. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities were burning, trade routes were breaking, and powerful kingdoms were falling apart. The Hittite Empire disappeared. The great palace cities of ancient Greece were destroyed or abandoned. Egypt was forced to fight for survival. It was as if the ancient world had reached the edge of a cliff. And moving through this collapsing world were mysterious groups that history would later call the Sea Peoples. But who were they? Were they the warriors who destroyed the Bronze Age? Or were they refugees and broken communities escaping from a disaster that had already begun? To understand the mystery, we need to return to the world before the collapse. The late Bronze Age was a time of powerful kings, rich palaces, strong armies, and long-distance trade. Egypt controlled the Nile and influenced lands far beyond its borders. The Hittite Empire ruled much of Anatolia. The palace kings of ancient Greece controlled strong cities and important sea routes. Assyria and Babylon remained major powers in the east. Between these kingdoms stood trading cities like Ugarit. Ships carried food, metals, wood, weapons, gifts, and messages between royal courts. Kings wrote letters to one another. They called each other brothers. They exchanged gold, horses, precious objects, and even members of their own families. This was not a world of separate kingdoms. It was one large system, and that system depended on trade. Bronze was the metal that gave the age its name. It was used for weapons, tools, armor, and objects of power. But bronze could not be made from one metal alone. It required copper and tin. Copper could be found in places such as Cyprus. Tin was much harder to find. It had to travel across long and dangerous routes. If those routes remained open, the palaces could make weapons and support their armies. But if the ships stopped arriving, the system began to weaken. The strength of the Bronze Age came from connection. Its weakness came from the same place. Then, several problems began to appear. Some studies suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean faced long periods of dry weather. Rain became less reliable. Harvests became weaker. Food became harder to find. A bad harvest does not destroy an empire by itself. But think about what happens when poor harvests continue. The price of grain rises. Storehouses begin to empty. Farmers leave their land. Rulers demand taxes from people who have less to give. Soldiers become harder to feed. Workers lose trust in the palace. Now add earthquakes. Add rebellion. Add wars between kingdoms. Add attacks along the coast. Add the collapse of trade. One disaster can be survived. But many disasters arriving at the same time can destroy the balance of an entire world. This is where the clay tablets of Ugarit become important. The city had trained writers who recorded trade, royal orders, political agreements, and private messages on clay. During the final days of Ugarit, the messages became more urgent. Enemy ships had appeared. Nearby places had been attacked. The city needed soldiers and ships. But many of its forces were away. They had been sent to help other kingdoms. Ugarit was part of a large system, but that system was no longer strong enough to protect it. The city called for help. The answer came too late. Ugarit burned. The fire destroyed the city, but it also hardened some of the clay tablets. Because of that fire, the final words of Ugarit survived. The destruction that ended the city also protected its last warning. But those tablets do not clearly tell us who the attackers were. For that, historians often look toward Egypt. On the walls of a temple built for Ramses III, we see scenes of war on land and sea. Egyptian soldiers fire arrows at crowded ships. Enemy warriors fall into the water. Other images show people moving with carts, supplies, women, and children. The Egyptian texts give names to several different groups. These groups were not called the Sea Peoples at the time. That name was created much later by modern historians. And this detail is important. The Sea Peoples may not have been one nation. They may not have been one army. They may not even have shared one goal. Some may have been raiders. Some may have been soldiers who once worked for the same kingdoms they later attacked. Some may have been families searching for new land. Others may have been refugees escaping hunger, war, and the fall of their own homes. An army carries weapons. A moving population carries families. The images from Egypt show both. This does not mean the Sea Peoples were peaceful. Cities were attacked. Coastal lands were destroyed. Egypt fought major battles against groups arriving by sea and by land. But the idea of one mysterious army appearing from nowhere and destroying every kingdom is too simple. Not every city fell in the same way. Not every city fell at the same time. Some places burned. Some were abandoned. Some lost their rulers but kept part of their population. Some kingdoms disappeared, while others survived in a weaker form. The Bronze Age did not end in one night. The collapse lasted for years. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire broke apart. Its capital, Hattusa, was abandoned and later destroyed. In ancient Greece, the palace system failed. The form of writing used by palace officials disappeared. Great centers of power lost their rulers, their records, and their old way of life. Across the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, cities faced war, movement, hunger, and political change. Egypt survived, but survival was not the same as victory. Ramses III claimed that Egypt had defeated the invaders. His temple walls show the king as a powerful protector. But even after the battles, Egypt continued to lose wealth and influence. The kingdom survived. The old world around it did not. So what really caused the Bronze Age collapse? The most honest answer is that there was no single cause. The Sea Peoples do not explain the dry weather. Dry weather does not explain every burned palace. Earthquakes do not explain organized attacks. Foreign enemies do not explain why many kingdoms were already weak inside. But together, these problems created a chain reaction. Poor harvests created hunger. Hunger created movement and anger. Weak kingdoms struggled to protect trade. Broken trade reduced food, metal, and money. Without those resources, rulers could not support armies or workers. People lost trust in the palaces. Local leaders became more independent. Rebellion became more likely. Enemies saw weakness. And each new crisis made the next one more dangerous. The ancient world did not collapse only because its enemies became stronger. It collapsed because its system became too weak to survive another shock. The Sea Peoples may have helped destroy that world, but they may also have been created by the same crisis. Behind every ship may have been a homeland already in ruins. Behind every moving family may have been an empty field or a burned city. Behind every attack may have been a struggle for food, safety, land, or survival. The people remembered as destroyers may also have been victims of destruction. And that is what makes this story so disturbing. There was no single villain. There was no one king whose death ended everything. There was no final battle that explains the whole collapse. Instead, a connected world slowly lost the power to hold itself together. The palaces looked strong. The walls still stood. The kings still spoke with confidence. But underneath the surface, the system was already breaking. When the enemy ships appeared, they may not have started the collapse. They may have simply revealed it. Still, history did not end. New kingdoms rose from the ruins. New trade routes appeared. New cities became important. The Phoenicians expanded their power across the sea. New groups settled along the coast. Iron slowly became more common. The palace world of the Bronze Age was gone, but human life continued. The world that followed was different. Power became less focused in a small group of royal courts. New people, new states, and new ideas began to shape the ancient world. The collapse destroyed a system. It did not destroy civilization itself. And perhaps this is the most important lesson left by the Sea Peoples. History often remembers the warriors who appeared during the final battle, but the true causes of collapse usually begin much earlier. They begin with empty storehouses, broken alliances, weak harvests, lost trust, leaders who cannot adapt, and systems that become too dependent on everything working perfectly. The Bronze Age world was rich, connected, and powerful. But it had become so connected that one failure could spread into another. When food became scarce, trade weakened. When trade weakened, palaces lost power. When palaces lost power, armies and borders became weaker. And when the ships appeared on the horizon, the ancient world was no longer ready to stop them. The Sea Peoples remain mysterious because we still do not know exactly where every group came from. We do not know whether they shared one plan. We do not know how many were attackers and how many were migrants. But we do know what they entered. They entered a world already in crisis. A world of frightened kings, empty roads, burning ports, and cities waiting for help that would never arrive. Ugarit sent its warning. 7 enemy ships had appeared. The message survived. The city did not. And across the Bronze Age world, the same silence was beginning to spread. If you enjoy cinematic journeys through forgotten empires, lost cities, ancient wars, and the mysteries left behind by fallen civilizations, subscribe to Empires Lost in Time. Because every fallen city leaves a warning, and every ruin still has a story to tell.